Om Tava Kathamritam Tapta Jeevanam Kavibhirididam Kalmasapaham Sravanamangalam Srimatatam Bhuvi Pranantiti Bhuritajana. So we are continuing this discussion on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna.
Which page?
Here, this is the page 86, 87. Here, Sri Ramakrishna gives a general analysis of spiritual seekers of different categories. There are those who are beginners. There are those who want to lead a spiritual life. And there are those who have no idea of anything beyond the body and beyond the senses. They are not interested in any kind of suprasensory or even intellectual or aesthetic ideas. Sri Ramakrishna calls them the ever-bound. He calls them Nitya Baddha, or those who are bound. They are not interested in any kind of spiritual life. He compares them with some fish who may be caught by the fishermen, caught in the nets, and who think they are in a very happy state in a happy condition. There are some fish who struggle and may not fully succeed. But there are some fish which calmly lie down in the nets, thinking that this is a much better home to live than the ocean, without knowing that they may soon be killed and be eaten. But they think that they are in a very happy state of life. Now for people who belong to this category, body is the only entity. Sensory pleasure, or whatever we enjoy with senses and mind, are the only things to be achieved. This material world, this physical world, this empirical phenomenal world is the only reality. There is nothing beyond them. They are like the fish which are very happy to remain in a very contented state without knowing that they are going to be killed and eaten. They are the ever bound, who never even make an attempt to go beyond the sensory level. Then there are those who make an attempt to move forward. Those who may not always succeed, but very often many of them do succeed. It's called mumukshu, mean those who are desirous of liberation, desirous of moksha or liberation. The general majority of spiritual seekers belong to this category. If they do not succeed in this life, they will certainly succeed in the next life. That's a very interesting principle to be remembered in spiritual life. Those who do make an effort will succeed, if not in this life, in the next life. I can drive home this idea of spiritual hunger for liberation in the light of a very interesting episode. It's again from the great classic Bhagavata Purana. There was a great emperor who was very famous for his nobility, for his virtues. When he became old, he decided to go to the forest and live the rest of his life immersed in contemplation. That was a tradition in ancient times. When people got old, they sometimes, very often, they went to a lonely place and spent the rest of their lifetime in solitude. The ancient lawgiver Manu gives a very interesting idea of how this is done. The verse is this: Grihasthasya yada pasyet bali paridamatmanaha apatyasya apatyam tudaranyam samasayit. It's a very interesting principle, and it is meant for householders. Grihasthasya yada pasyet. When an householder sees that his hair has gone grey, his face has become wrinkled, and in modern times paying a visit to the dentist every week, or maybe to the lab for blood test or whatever maybe. When they reach that stage, they should not linger around in their own homes, seeing Terminator 1, 2, 3, 4, one thriller after another, and enjoying this life. What they should do? They should go to a solitary place. In those days, forest was. See, the word vijanam actually doesn't necessarily mean a forest. It means solitary place. Vigatam janam, means there are no people, no crowd around. Away from the maddening crowd, to use that expression, famous phrase. So they should go to solitude, and husband and wife should spend the rest of their lifetime in contemplation, reading holy scriptures, thinking of life beyond. So this should be done when an householder finds his or her hair has gone grey, face has wrinkled, or again when she or he sees the face of grandson, let us say granddaughter either. That means the family tradition will be, the progeny will be continued, they need not worry, so they can retire to solitary place. So this king, Bharata, that is his name, Bharata, he decided to go to the forest and spend the rest of his lifetime in contemplation, meditation and solitude. And then he lived, and just a few months before he passed away, an interesting incident took place right in the vicinity of his hermitage. One she deer was chased by a lion, and this deer was pregnant. As the lion chased the deer out of fear for its life, it tries to cross a small stream, and in the process it fell into the stream. It died, but a baby deer was floating in the water, and the king, this emperor, who was meditating or maybe contemplating in the nearby hermitage, jumped and saved this deer, this baby deer, and it lived in that hermitage for a long time. Now the king's life underwent a complete change and transformation. Till this episode took place, he was mostly immersed in meditation, contemplation, reading holy scriptures and so on. He was a very big king and emperor, and he had announced everything. He had declared his son as the next emperor, heir apparent, and had come to the forest. Now what happened? He saved the baby deer, that is perfectly alright, but instead of his sons and daughters whom he left behind in the palace, he tried to look upon this baby deer with great love and affection, and that's nothing wrong in it, but great attachment. So instead of thinking about God, he started thinking about this deer all the time. So we can imagine, attachment sometimes becomes a great shackle that binds us to this world. He had left the kingdom, his palace, his relatives, his wife, his children, all, just to live the rest of his lifetime in solitude. But now what happened? Instead of thinking about God, instead of spending his time in meditation or contemplation, he spent all his lifetime in taking care of this baby deer. He could have done it with some non-attachment. He could have done it at the same time spending his spare time at least for contemplation and meditation. But he completely forgot that aspect. That's how Maya often catches us from behind. If Maya cannot catch you by the throat, it catches you from behind. And Maya is a kind of golden chain that binds us to the world. It comes as an apparently pleasant experience, but its binding effect, its imprisoning effect, we may not realize until it's too late. So, the king got very old. He had forgotten the ideal for which he left his home and palace. He had completely forgotten his routine, getting up in the morning, meditating on God, reading Holy Scriptures, everything he forgot. It's like coming to this Lake Tahoe retreat center and completely avoiding attending the classes or meditation and going about outside some casinos, what happens, something like that. In fact, in the case of this king, something much worse happened. When he was about to die, it was not contemplation on God that he had that accompanied him, but it was a deep attachment to this deer. So he was reborn as a deer. Now, there's a theory, there is a law in Vedantic tradition that whatever is the strong mental tendency or impression or flash of thought with which you leave this world, that will in a way influence or determine the next phase of your life. Your next life. So look at the king, his life. He was a man of great renunciation. He had given up everything. He had done a lot of spiritual practices. He was a very sincere seeker, but he was caught in this. Now you may ask the question, was there something wrong in saving the life of a poor deer? Nothing wrong. He should have done it. But he should not have substituted that deer for God, for spiritual life. He would have continued looking at the deer, and also he would have continued his spiritual practices. That he didn't do. He completely forgot the spiritual aspect of his life and focused only on rearing this baby deer. So when he died, he was reborn as a deer. But then remember, whatever spiritual practices he had already done in his life won't be lost. As I said yesterday, Tattradam buddhisamyogam labhade paurvadehikam yatadecha tado bhuya samsiddhu gurunandana. It's a famous promise with Lord Krishna says in the 6th chapter, when Arjuna asked the question, suppose I do a lot of spiritual practices, meditation, japa, contemplation and so on, but then I do not achieve my goal and then I die. What happens to me? I will be lost in this world because I won't be able to enjoy this world, and I also would die without attaining the highest spiritual enlightenment. Lord Krishna says no. This intellect which has gathered tendencies and impressions through spiritual practices in this life, those tendencies and impressions will continue and outlive your body, and they will remain intact. And next life, you will be under the influence of these spiritual tendencies that you have gathered and accumulated in your previous life. And that will help you to move forward. That's the idea behind. That's why sometimes I used to say, even to be able to withstand a discussion on Vedanta, we must have already done a lot of spiritual practices and contemplation. If not in this life, maybe next life. Sometimes, Sri Ramakrishna used to tell some of his visitors, all sorts of people used to come to him. Some of them were very eager to listen to Sri Ramakrishna's discussion on spiritual topics. They will listen to him spellbound. And there will be some other people. They will feel restless. They feel a bit bored. This God meditation. So they may be trying to have their friends back. We can go, maybe there are some wonderful places. So Sri Ramakrishna sometimes used to notice this. Then he will tell, oh, you better go and have a look in the garden, go around, see wonderful flowers, gardens, trees, everything. Sri Ramakrishna knew. So he will tell you, just go about, have a walk, long stroll outside. And and those who are interested in spiritual life, he will remain in the room and he will talk to them. So what really happens is, in this king's life, he was born as a deer in the next life, but the deer had not forgotten what it did in its previous life. As a king, it had practiced renunciation, and also something happened, there was a slight deviation, that also the deer remembered. So it lived in the same hermitage. It won't move away from the hermitage. It will lay there, it will eat the grass there and move away from there. It did not associate itself with the other deers because it wanted to remain within the vicinity of that ashrama, hermitage. And when it died, what happened? It was born as a great spiritual saint. Now the king died with a deep obsessive attachment to the deer and was reborn as a deer. The deer died with great contemplation on God. It was born as a great saint. And that saint was a great Paramahamsa. He was called Jada Bharata. He was born as the younger brother in a family, and he won't speak. Because he didn't want to get associated with anything or anybody. He wanted to completely focus his mind on God and spiritual ideas. So his brothers thought this fellow is a moron and idiot. They took away all his wealth and drove him out of homes. And he was moving. And he was a well-built man. So a king was moving in a palanquin, a kind of ancient, primitive vehicle, mostly borne by but moved by human effort. People used to bear it on their shoulders. So the king found a healthy man, apparently very lazy, was moving about. He called him, you come here and help my bearers to bear this palanquin. But this man was always thinking about God and spirituality. He was not interested in anything, any material enjoyment. He was in another world. His mind was always in a transcendental plane. So he could not walk in harmony with the other palanquin bearers. So there was a lot of jerking. And the king thought this fellow was quite disobedient, indisciplined. And then the king scolded him. In response to the scolding, this man, who was a deer in his previous life and a great embodiment of renunciation in his previous life, this man taught the king, that is one of the highest and most sublime exposition of Vedantic philosophy. Now, just imagine, it means every struggle has its importance and its utility. So when we are talking about the spiritual seekers who succeed and who do not succeed, we should keep in mind that those who do not succeed may not succeed in this life, but they are sure to succeed sometime in future, because in spiritual life no effort will be wasted.
Swamiji, could you tell us what that text is?
It is Bhagavata Purana. You can find Jada Bharata Ubhakyanam. the story of Jada Bharata
And
in the
then
Bhagavata Purana.
his exposition of Vedanta.
In
is
fact,
that.
the king scolded him. This man replied, "Whom are you scolding? I am not this body. I am the Atma. And how can you scold my Atma? I am the immanent, all-pervading reality." So, the whole of Vedanta is condensed in this saint's response to the angry king. The king's name is Rahu Gana. His name is Jada Bharata. Jada means, it means lifeless, it means inactive, lethargic, lifeless, unresponsive, those who do not react out of maybe idiocy. That's what it really means. But in the case of this Jada Bharata, he was not responding to anything in this world because his mind was above the world. His mind was in a transcendental plane. He always lived in a high state of ecstasy. We will have a very active, interesting discussion during the interaction for after 10 o'clock. Please remember to ask the same question.
Well, people are taking notes and I thought they might write that down.
Oh yes, fine. But please remember, we'll continue this discussion. Very interesting, very relevant lesson for all spiritual seekers. No effort is wasted. That's I get behind. Now, Sri Ramakrishna says, as I said, there are 4 types of people in the world. There are those who are bound and happy that they are bound. So far as they are concerned, this world is the only reality. This world of senses is the only reality. But then, if we go to some highly educated, enlightened, thinking people, and if you tell them this phenomenal world, this universe is the only reality, they won't agree with you. They may not know that this world is only a relative entity. They may not have any idea of another level of reality, the absolute reality. But they will agree with you that this empirical universe cannot be an eternal reality. Why? Because even if you look at this universe, its total age may be less than 14 billions of years. If you believe in Big Bang, and it may come to an end, it may take another form. Anything which changes its form according to time belongs to time. And anything that belongs to time, space and causation cannot be absolutely real, cannot be absolutely unreal either. It is called relative. Its existence is only relativity. Now, see, if you ask an Einstein, he won't tell you this world as we see and experience, this world that we live in, that we interact with, is the only eternal, unchanging reality. No scientist, even no educated person will agree with that. So, for such people, this world is indescribable. They are not sure about the absolute reality, but those who do not have an idea of metaphysics beyond physics, well, they will tell you that this world is certainly not absolutely real, but we have no idea of what is absolutely real. So they may at the most tell you it is beyond description, beyond explanation. It is unknown. They are agnostics, they would say it is indescribable. But if you ask the great saint whose story we just narrated, Jada Bharata, who expounded Vedanta to that angry king, so far as he is concerned, this world is unreal. In the sense, this world is not absolutely real. So, For such great spiritual souls, the enlightened ones, Atman or Brahman, or in monotheistic devotional terms, God is the only reality. Now, in fact, many of the spiritual seekers belong to this category. Now, there are the spiritually liberated souls. They are called muktas, the liberated ones. Among them, there are two categories. There are those who work very hard, they struggle, and they get liberated, like the fish that struggle when it is caught within the net. And in the process, it may jump out of the net and may go back to the ocean. So it liberates itself from imprisonment, from bondage. Most of the spiritual seekers become liberated through this self-effort and also maybe God's grace. But there are a few rare ones who are born liberated. Sri Ramakrishna calls them Nitya Muktas, the great spiritual teachers of the world. So Baddha means they are bound, eternally bound. Then there are Mumukshu, the seekers. Among them, there are many who become Muktas, the liberated ones, and there are those who are born in this world who teach mankind. They never caught within the net, they are never bound, they are born liberated. For the liberated ones, this world, this empirical phenomenal world, is not the only reality. It is only a relative entity. For them, God is the only reality. So you find there is an evolution in spiritual life. Our idea of God, our idea of the absolute reality is very often determined by our own spiritual evolution. The most primitive people, as we mentioned yesterday, believe that God lives in a temple and He never comes out of the temple. Or God can be approached only if you pray to Him in a church, not elsewhere, or in a synagogue or a mosque or a place of worship. God will be terribly unhappy with you if you read another book. And some of them will tell you, we have a wonderful understanding with God. God is on our side. So we can fight with our enemies and God will help us in our fight. Now this is a very, very primitive, a wrong concept of God and absolute reality. As we move further in spiritual life, we gradually realize that true spiritual life is and cannot be confined, cannot be confined to the meditation room or a place of worship or rituals, but true spiritual life is possible not only within the place of worship, not only within the temple and church, but even outside. We could feel the presence of God even outside the temple, outside the church. That is the time when spirituality actually begins in our life. So, for the primitive people, God has a definite form, a shape, names, certain characteristics, and they always interpret God in terms of the narrow geographical, cultural, ethnic characteristics, socio-anthropological characteristics, into which the prophet who propounds that God is born. But for the true spiritual seekers, God is a universal, eternal, all-pervading reality. Now, this is with regard to the evolution in the concept of God. There is also another evolution at the micro level, at the level of the spiritual seeker. That also should be kept in mind to fully understand Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. I have not started reading this portion, but before starting to read, I will narrate this particular aspect of evolution at the level of spiritual seekers. this can be better explained and described in the light of a very interesting, not a story, but a very famous episode described in one of our Upanishads, Kathopanishad. The Kathopanishad, there is a dialogue. In fact, it's in the form of a dialogue between the great teacher Yama, the Lord of Death, that's how he's portrayed, and a small boy. The story begins like this. Story is not so very important, but there are 3 levels of spiritual evolution. Evolution of human life as a whole, which are portrayed in this dialogue. But the story should be given as a background. The story is the story of a small boy. His name is Nachiketa. His father was a great philanthropist and also a sage. But he also wanted to be known as a great philanthropist. He wanted to publish his great reputation as a man of philanthropical spirit. Anyway, one day he was distributing cows, wealth, all his possessions among the needy people. But instead of distributing useful cows that can give us milk, he was distributing old cows which cannot eat grass and which cannot give us milk. Maybe he can only give us kicks if we try to milk them. So, in fact, the Upanishad described Pidodaka, Jagdadruna, Dugdadoga, Nirindriya. The 4 adjectives are given to describe the characteristics of the cows that were being offered as a gift among the people. So this man was actually playing a trick which the boy realized when he closely watched his own father in action. So cows which cannot drink any more milk, which already drank whatever, not milk, water, Cows which cannot drink water. Cows which have already drunk whatever water it could drink in this life. That's the meaning of Pidodaka. And then cows which cannot eat grass, which cannot give milk. These are the characteristics of the cows which the father was trying to offer as a gift among the needy people, poor people. Now the boy closely watched this and he realized his father is actually committing a great sacrilege, a great sin. He wanted to save his father from committing this sinful deed. He wanted to bring him to some senses of his duty. So he asked, to whom are you going to give me? Kasmai mam dasyasidi, the question is put in the Upanishads. To whom are you going to give me? This is the question. Now there is an interesting aspect to this question. The highest possession of a father is an obedient son, because the father had only one son. So the son is the most precious wealth of a father. Son or daughter, but in this man's case he had only one son. His name was Nachiketa. Now, what should you distribute among the people? You should not distribute things that you don't want. You should distribute those things which you value most. Then only you can be called a philanthropist. If you distribute your trash can, you cannot be called a philanthropist. You should be able to distribute those precious things which you value most, which you love very most. Then only you can be called a person of philanthropy, generosity. So the son goes to his father and asks the question, Kasmai mam dasyasidi, to whom are you going to give me? Now the father got angry. He was doing this wonderful deed, distributing worthless, jaded, battered old cows among the people. And he thought he was a very clever man. And this boy annoyed him when he asked him. So, Didiyam Tridiyam Sahovaja, means the boy approached the father and put this question 3 times. The father got annoyed and answered, Murtave Tvam Didami. The meaning is, I am going to give you as a gift to the Lord of Death. That was the cruel reply from the father. You remember, part of the story is mythological, the other part is extremely philosophical, metaphysical and spiritual. This is a mythological background that should be kept in mind to better appreciate the philosophical part of it, the later part. Now, to keep the promise of his father, to make his father's words come true, fulfill his father's words, the boy started his journey to the Lord of Death, his palace. When he reached there, the Lord of Death, Yama, that's his name, he was away. He was not at home. And the boy waited for 3 days without food and water, without hungry and thirsty. He waited. Maybe Yama's servants offered him food, but he refused. He said, I will have my food only after your host returns home. So, when Yama returned home, he found this small boy waiting for him. He felt very much, somewhat upset, and that too without food and water, hungry and thirsty. So in compensation for this, Yama allowed him to ask for 3 boons. And Nachiketa asked for 3 boons. These 3 boons represent 3 levels of human evolution, human spiritual evolution. That's a metaphysical and spiritual part of the story. The first boon that the boy asked is this: when I go back to my home, my father should not get angry with me. He should not scold me. Now a little boy of 5 or 6 years leaves his home without father's or parents' permission. At least in those days, maybe today it may be fully admitted, but in ancient times it was supposed to be totally unacceptable, an act of disobedience. So he possibly feared that his father will scold him. So the first boon that he wanted was, when I go back to my home, my father should speak to me with great love and affection, without any agitation, should not be angry with me. Shanta sankalpa sumano yadhasya vidamanyu gautamo ma abhimurtyu tat prasishtam ma abhivadet prasida edat trayana prathamam varam pranaya. This is the first boon. This is the first boon I am asking. The point is, my father should speak to me with great affection, without any agitation. He should not get angry with me. In fact, that's the first stage of human evolution. What do we normally want, normal human beings? We want home, we want comforts. We want every material desire satisfied and fulfilled. That's the first need of not only human beings, human civilization. If you look at the history of human civilizations, first, hunter-gatherer stage, then people settled in agricultural settlements, the evolution into full-fledged society, then social structure develops, then division of labor develops. So anthropologists will explain, sociologists will explain the gradual evolution of human civilization. The idea of higher spiritual values evolved at a much later stage. So on the one hand, we have this socio-anthropological evolution. From the primitive hunter-gatherer stage of evolution to modern industrialized, urbanized state. But that evolution is only at the surface, at the level of civilization. But there is a higher evolution at the level of culture, where you first go for the fulfillment of primary human needs and demands. So Yama was very happy to grant this boon. There was nothing wrong in it. He quickly granted. Now what happens to people who have got plenty of money, a lot of high reputation, high status in society, plenty of money in the bank, give big official status. Then they start thinking about, well, what happens to me after my death? Because fear of death becomes appears as a monster before them. Then they start doing some good work, philanthropic activities. They start giving donation. They may start big foundation in their name. These are all good things, great things. What is the motive behind? To ensure that the enjoyments that they have in this life will continue in the next life, or at least at some transcendental afterlife stage, post-mortem stage. So without an idea of a trans-physical, trans-empirical existence, nobody can do any noble and selfish deed. Swami Vivekananda yesterday, Swamiji's lectures, Professor was reading, or Christopher was reading. See, the higher ethics is possible only if we take our mind away from the world of senses, the world of physical bodily enjoyments. Otherwise, if physical happiness is the goal of human life, then you can easily rob and make money and enjoy that. But maybe there are many clever people who can evade the police. They could do that. But there is a higher spiritual principle that acts as a foundation for morality and ethics. What is that? Something that goes beyond the concepts of bodily enjoyment, sensory enjoyment, something that goes beyond the empirical, the phenomenal ideas of life and existence. Now, Nachiketa's, this boy's next boon, the second boon, was related to this. He knew that Lord of Death, the Yama, had ensured that you'll have a very peaceful, happy, prosperous life in this world. But what about life after death? So he wanted that he should be able to enjoy the same happiness, peace and tranquility at his post-mortem stage. So his next boon, his next boon was that I should be able to go to heaven. You should teach me that particular Vedic ritual which ensures that I will be able to go to heaven and enjoy life there. Sasattam agnim swargyam adhesha mrityu prabruhidam saddadhanaya mahyam swargaloka amrutatvam bhajante edad dvidiyena vrane varena. This is the second book. I am just quoting this verse at random just to, so that those who are interested, we can read the text continuation. So the next one was, you should teach me this particular religious ritual, Vedic ritual, which will ensure that I will be able to enjoy heavenly comforts after death. Now, in most non-Advaitic, non-Vedantic traditions, the highest aspiration ends with going to heaven. Now, if you analyze what the idea of living in heaven, in all religions, whether Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, everywhere you find, heaven is nothing but an extension of life in this world. Whatever we desire, whatever we want, whatever desires we want to be fulfilled in this life, we want those desires to be fulfilled at a post-mortem afterlife stage. That is our concept of heaven. That's why in the long descriptions of heaven, in most organized religions, there is everything, plenty of fruits. The weather condition is absolutely fine, and you never get old, you never get sick, and everything is wonderful. Practically, it's an extension of life in a 6-star hotel without payment. That's all. Now the point is, this is perfectly all right, because even an aspiration for going to heaven is not possible without a sincere spiritual aspiration to go beyond the bodily level, the sensory level. You won't find it the higher, because the idea of heaven is also associated with some celestial beings inhabited by angels, gods, in Hindu tradition called in a plurality of gods, Indra, Varuna, etc. Some divine beings who are certainly good people. They are very good natured, they are well-meaning people, they help us, and they also enable us to share their heavenly comforts. This is the concept of heavenly life. Even this concept of heavenly life, it marks a higher level of evolution of human aspirations. Very often, our aspirations define where we stand. If you ask a boy and if he says, I want gingerbread, Swami Vivekananda mentioned in the forest days reading, so religion should be able to give us plenty of gingerbread. Then that religion is fine. So that religion is only very empirical religion. True religion should take us far beyond even the need for gingerbread. Even the desire for gingerbread should not arise when we start spiritual life. So, this boy now felt somewhat happy and contented. I will be able to lead a very happy life in this world. When I go back to my home, my father won't scold me. That's fine. And not only that, after living a long life in this world, happy and prosperous life, I will be able to go to heaven and enjoy heavenly enjoyments for a very long time. Surgaloka amrudatvam bhajante, that word means, I heard that in heaven, these angels and gods and goddesses live for thousands of years, long life. So I want to live like that. So immediately this Yama granted the second, because Nachiketa had not asked for anything truly spiritual. So Yama was very happy. If you ask God, in devotional classics it is said, if you ask God for true devotion, true spiritual enlightenment, he will be a bit stingy. He will be very careful. He will test you. But if you ask for material comforts, he will very easily grant. Because, Guru Maharaj Sri Ramakrishna says the Gospel, mother is playing, children are crying. If children are crying, the mother will put one chocolate in children's mouth, maybe a toy thrown to them. And children are happy eating the chocolate, playing with the toys. Mother will be perfectly satisfied. The child throws away the chocolate and toys, then cries to be taken in her lap by the mother. Then only mother actually takes the trouble to come to the boy, come to the child. Otherwise, he may perhaps give a big Chinese toy, and children will be very happy. Similarly, if people ask for material comforts, long life, promotion, money, wealth, God will be very liberal or very generous. But if you ask for higher spiritual truth, then we'll be very careful. You have to go through a grueling test, examination. So when Nachiketa asked for the third boon, the third boon that he asked, he was, Ayam prede vijikitsa manushi asti tyege na ayam asti di jayege edad vidya manusishtastoyaham varanam esha varas trutiya. This is my third boon. I heard, according to some people, when we die, that's the end of the journey. When body comes to an end, when our life ends up with a piece of stone, the burial ground, or when the body is pushed to that, the gas chamber, whatever, maybe the heat chamber, the cremation home. If that is the end of the journey, then what's the meaning of human existence? A tree and a human being, there is not much difference. So, if all human aspirations, efforts, mysticism, philosophy, poetry, music, painting, everything. If everything ends in the form of a piece of stone, the burial ground, then there is nothing very glorious about it. So Nachiketa asked the question. Some people say, when this body comes to an end, everything is over. But according to some other people, when this body comes to an end, everything is not over, because life or death is only a semicolon, not a full stop. Even after the destruction of the body, an indestructible Atman continues to exist. What is the real truth behind the mystery? Eda Didyam Anusishtas Toyagam literally means, I want to be taught by you this eternal, immortal, spiritual knowledge. I want this immortal, spiritual knowledge from you. You are the one who should teach me. This is my third boon. When this request came from Nachiketa, the Yama was a bit perturbed, because that's not the boon which people generally ask for. Normally, the kind of boon that we ask for will be very often according to our own taste and our own temperament. You heard of, to give an idea of this, there's an interesting story of Bhasmasura in one of the Puranic stories. He was a demon, a monster. But he was a terrible fool also. So he did penance for a long time. This is a mythological story, it was a great message behind. So a god appeared before him. And you know what this man wanted, this monster? He wanted, on whomsoever I place my hand, that person should die immediately. Maybe he had plenty of enemies whom he wanted to kill or disturb. So this is the boon I want. On whomsoever I place my hands, that person should die immediately. The poor helpless god was, because he had promised, whatever you want, I shall give you. Because he thought this man is a sincere spiritual seeker. He never could imagine that this Bhasmasura would ever ask for such a terrible boon. So he was helpless, he had given the promise, so he had to keep it. All right. He gave that boon. Now what happened? Bhasmasura was not only foolish but slightly mischievous. He wanted to test this on the very god who gave him this boon. So he tried to place his hand on the head of Shiva. Shiva is a mythological story. Yeah. Now Shiva he ran helter-skelter. He never imagined this man will turn against him. And he ran everywhere with Bhasmasura chasing him. Finally, Shiva knew there was another deity, Vishnu, who was not only great but also sufficiently intelligent and not so gullible as Shiva. So Vishnu knew how to tackle this mischievous monster. So when Bhasmasura chasing Shiva appeared before Vishnu, Bhasmasura wanted to test his evil power on his own guru. That's a great mystery behind him. The one who gave him this boon. Vishnu asked him, come on, sit down. And what's the matter with you? Bhasmasura explained, what a fool you are. Do you really believe in the boon given by the Shiva? Otherwise you test it, put your hand on your own head, I can guarantee nothing will happen to you. So Vishnu wanted to play the same trick which Bhasmasura was playing upon Shiva. Bhasmasura, as I said, he was not only mischievous monster but also sufficiently foolish. So he was so flattered by Vishnu. I can tell you, you are a very intelligent man. Why do you take seriously a promise, a boon given by the Shiva? Otherwise you test it on your own head. And he kept his hand on his own head and he died. So very often the kind of boon that we ask for more or less depends upon our own spiritual, cultural evolution. So Nachiketa was a highly gifted person. So you can imagine, Nachiketa travels all the way from the state of bound soul to the state of liberated soul. The third boon he asked was the knowledge of liberation, the knowledge of spiritual liberation, the highest spiritual enlightenment. And Yama tested him, promised him with a lot of wealth, power, promised to make him the emperor of the world. Bhume Mahadayanam Vrinishwa. You ask for the whole world, whole universe, I shall make you the emperor of the world. I shall give you wealth, everything. Nachiketa said, no, no, no. I want the final, ultimate, supreme spiritual knowledge. And Yama explained that to him. Told him, you are that absolute reality, the Atman, which is present in the tiniest of the tiny, the smallest of the small things, and also in the grandest, the largest of large things. So, Anoraniyan Mahutu Mahiyan Atma Sijintohu Nihidam Guhayam Tamakradu Pasyati Vigatashogaha Dhadu Prasadat Mahimanam Atmana. In reality, you are not this body, not mind, not intellect, not the senses. You are the all-pervading, immanent, transcendental Atman. This Atman is present as the immanent reality in the tiniest atom, Anohu Aniya. And also in the largest, at the highest macro level, at the lowest micro level. This Atman is present. So, understand this Atman is the one who travels in a chariot. The chariot is the body. Atmanam Ridhinam Vidhi, Sariram Ridhamevacha, Buddhintu Saradhim Vidhi. The traveler in the chariot is Atman. The driver is intellect, Buddhi. And mind is the reins, and the senses are the horses. The sensory world constitutes the path that the horses have to take. So, if you are endowed with spiritual wisdom, the journey of human life will take you to the ultimate spiritual goal. So, if you focus your mind on this supreme spiritual liberation, the highest spiritual knowledge, and if you are able, if your intellect is reinforced by this discerning mind, by this knowledge and wisdom, then you'll be able to control your mind properly. Your mind becomes an efficient instrument in your hands. So, you are the driver, the intellect. Mind is the reins. So, Atmanam Ridhinam Vidhi Sariram Rithamevacha Buddhintu Sarathim Vidhi. The driver is Buddhi. If the driver has got a discerning mind, discrimination, then he will be able to handle the reins in his hands properly. And in the hands of such a driver, the horses will be very obedient. Horses will take you, the chariot will take you to the desired destination. But if you are not equipped with this discerning mind, then the horses may take you in the wrong direction. The chariot will hit against a boulder and you may fall over the precipice. So, one should always be equipped with this discerning mind, wisdom. And this wisdom ensures that you are able to control the senses, which are the horses, with an effective mind, which is the reins, and then this journey of spiritual life will lead to fulfillment. Otherwise, it will become a failure, a tragedy. So, now, Sri Ramakrishna, against this background, Sri Ramakrishna says, there are 4 types of people. The ever bound, who never make an attempt, for whom the sensory world is only reality, nothing beyond. Then there are those who seek, the mumuksha, those who are spiritual seekers, those who seek the ultimate spiritual truth. Among them, there are those who struggle and succeed, and there are those who are born liberated. And then there are those who don't require any effort. The great spiritual teachers of the world are born liberated. They are nitya mukta, means they are ever liberated. That's the idea behind. Keeping all this in mind, if you read this paragraph, you find Sri Ramakrishna actually gives a gist of the whole of spiritual metaphysics contained in the Upanishadic literature. In this creation of God, there is a variety of things: men, animals, trees, plants. Among the animals, some are good, some bad. There are ferocious animals, like the tiger. Some trees bear fruit sweet as nectar, and others bear fruit that's poisonous. Likewise, among human beings, there are the good and the wicked, the holy and unholy. There are some who are devoted to God, and others who are attached to the world. Men may be divided into 4 classes: those bound by the fetters of the world, the seekers of liberation, the liberated, and the ever free. So you compare the whole principle to the imagery of the fisherman catching fish. There are some very clever varieties of fish which are never caught by the fishermen. They are the ever free, ever liberated. Some may get caught but struggle and attain liberation. Some may imagine getting caught in the fish net as a great boon. That's the most difficult problem. Because the moment we mistake the real for the unreal, we also mistake the unreal for the real. So, one way out, to become at least a struggling fish, an active spiritual seeker, is to keep in touch with these spiritual ideas and interact with people whose association will help us to enrich and reinforce our spiritual aspirations. That's very important. Sri Ramakrishna gives a very interesting, a very emphatic idea in many contexts. He says, Mahapurusha Samsaya. Shankaracharya in the Vivekananda he says, Manishuttum, Mumukshuttum, Mahapurusha Samsaya. So, to be born as a human being is a great gift of God. And to be born as a spiritual seeker is a great another gift. And again, to get a chance to be associated with a liberated soul or people who are interested in spiritual life is much more important, because unless we associate with fellow spiritual seekers and if we associate with people who drag us away from spiritual aspirations, there cannot be any spiritual growth. So that's why Sri Ramakrishna says those who are seekers after liberation should always keep holy company. Among the ever free, we may count sages like Narada. They live in the world for the good of others to teach men spiritual path. Narada, as I said yesterday, was a great guide and philosopher who came to the rescue to help spiritual seekers everywhere. He was a teacher who taught Prahlada, and he was the teacher of Dhruva, and he was the teacher of many of the great spiritual seekers mentioned in the mythological literature. The seekers after liberation want to be free themselves from attachment to the world. Some of them succeed, some of them do not. The liberated souls, such as sadhus and mahatmas, are not entangled in the world in worldly pursuits. Their minds are free from worldliness. Besides, they always meditate on the lotus feet of the Lord. Sri Ramakrishna mentions in many other contexts this problem of worldliness. The worldliness is essentially a psychological attitude. We should not associate worldliness as literally living in this world. Worldliness means being worldly minded. Worldly mindedness. It's more of an attitude. One can live in this world and still be away from the world. One can live away from the world, still mentally living in worldliness or worldly mindedness. So, the one remedy that Sri Ramakrishna recommends on innumerable occasions is this. We should see that the water doesn't enter the boat. The boat should be on the surface of the water. You think of crossing the river in a ferry, a boat. If there is a leak on the boat, and if the water enters the boat, it may capsize. But if the water doesn't enter the boat, if there is no leak, we can cross the river. We won't get wet. So, but there is a way out. What's meant by crossing this world of this river of life in a boat? Taking the name of God. That's a normal prescription that Sri Ramakrishna gives. If we extend the meaning, if we interpret it, then we can say it means living in contact with our spiritual idea. Taking the name of God is the most common and maybe the easiest. But in general way, reading the scriptures, discussing these ideas, even discussing philosophy is helpful. Even discussing higher aesthetics is helpful because it helps you to keep your mind away from the world of senses. All efforts should be aimed at keeping the mind away and above the sensory level. That's the first step. Poetry may be helpful, music may be helpful, philosophical discussion may be helpful, but they are not enough. But they are certainly very helpful in keeping the mind away from the world of senses. The liberated souls such as sadhus and mahatmas are not entangled in the world. Their minds are free from worldliness. Besides, they always meditate on the lotus feet of God. Suppose a net has been cast into a lake to catch fish. Some fish are so clever that they are never caught in the net. I gave this imaginary example earlier. They are like the ever free. But most of the fish are entangled in the nets. Some of them try to free themselves from it. And they are like those who seek liberation. As I said earlier, there are two categories in this group. There are those who succeed and there are those who do not succeed. Now, one point to be remembered in this context is, in Vedantic tradition, life is not just one chance. Not one chance. If you do not succeed in this life, there is always the possibility of continuing the journey in the next life. So, eventually, all sincere seekers will attain liberation, if not in this life, in the next life, or in the succeeding life sometime. But not all the fish that struggle succeed in this life. A very few do jump out of the net, making a big splash in the water. Then the fishermen shout, "Look, there goes a big one." So remember, Sri Ramakrishna was teaching, sitting on the bank of Ganga. The temple where he lived was on the banks of Ganga. So many of the parables, stories, and imageries and similes are taken from the local setting. On the contrary, now Sri Ramakrishna is referring to the other type of fish. But most of the fish caught in the net cannot escape, nor do they make any effort to get out. On the contrary, they burrowed into the mud with the net in their mouths and lie there quietly, thinking, "We need not fear anymore, we are quite safe here." A few minutes later, they are killed and they are eaten. So very often this happens, it's a great problem. First, we must be able to wake up and open the eyes. This is possible through any of the four karma yogas. Doing unselfish work is one way of waking up and opening the eyes. Or just to make an analysis of the world and experiences that we see around us. If we constantly meditate on the transitoriness, the momentariness of everything that goes on in this world, the fact that everything one day comes to an end, is enough for us to remember some eternal, infinite, immortal, everlasting reality. So, we will continue this discussion next day. I think today we are a bit late. We'll continue with the same discussion tomorrow. Now we'll have interaction, maybe for about 15 minutes.
Swami, Sri Ramakrishna suggests frequently that a person go into solitude and keep away from his family and just meditate and read scriptures and so on. And Narada says that invariably the best practice is holy company. How would you compare these two practices, solitude and holy company?
Going into solitude also includes going to meet some holy person. Solitude here means away from the worldly surroundings. Going to the presence of a holy person or a temple is going away from worldly surroundings. That's the meaning here. The word used in Sanskrit is vijana. Vijana means vigatajana, but there are not many worldly minded people moving about. Otherwise, physical solitude need not necessarily be very helpful unless our mind is ready for it. Suppose our mind is not ready. If you go to solitude, try to meditate, the condition will become much worse. Because in solitude, a person whose mind is not ready will feel much more disturbed than in the company of people, fellow spiritual seekers. But in Sri Ramakrishna gives this instruction probably while addressing a group of merchants, Marwari merchants, who visited him. In fact, the conversation took place in Hindi. They asked Sri Ramakrishna, we are all worldly minded, hum log samsari, and we are all worldly minded people. What will happen to us? They were very devoted people, pious people, but they were very clever businessmen also. No, if Sri Ramakrishna had told them, well, doing business, going for profit is not correct. You should renounce everything. They would not understand Sri Ramakrishna's words. They won't be able to practice it. They would think religion and spirituality are not practical. So Sri Ramakrishna gives them the exact dose of the spiritual medicine that will work for them. So he tells them. In fact, in one context he says, I can read from this in another context. You are all very clever people. You are like people soldiers fighting within a fort. If you come out of the fort, you are more vulnerable to enemy attack. But if a garrison is more safe, fighting from within the fort. So once a while, you go to a lonely place, talk to some spiritually elevated souls, that will be very helpful. Here I can tell you, there is an interesting portion, Sri Ramakrishna says, but one should spend some time in solitude and attain knowledge. Then one can lead the life of an householder. Janaka lived the world after attaining knowledge. When you have gained it, you may live anywhere. Then nothing matters. You are leading an householder's life. That's very good. It's like fighting from the fort. Fighting is a garrison. So, when the fort is besieged by the enemies, the garrison, a small garrison, can effectively defend the fort. So, an householder, for all practical purposes, can do and perform their household responsibilities, duties, everything. At the same time, once a while, go to temple, to a holy person, or solitude, if that's possible, and meditate, read holy scriptures, contemplate or discuss spiritual topics, subjects with fellow spiritual seekers, other spiritual aspirants. All these will help a spiritual seeker to live, to keep away from worldliness. That's the idea. Any further discussion? We don't have much time. Still 10 minutes more.
Could you spell the name of the demon who went to Shiva to get a boon?
Anyway, his name was Bhasmasura. Bhasmasura's name. So,
They want to spell it.
Could you spell it?
Bhasmasura. Bhasmasura. So,
Bhasma means to burn into ashes, right?
yeah, that man was he was trying to propitiate Lord Shiva, so he used to put plenty of this. But he was sufficiently mischievous with a very noble motive with him. So that's the story.
Swami, when you were telling us the story about the king, you said that it was commonly understood that the last thought before one dies affected the next birth. Is that myth or is that actual?
Well, I have discussed this matter with some medical professionals who are in this profession. They say, of course not in all cases, but the thought that you carried uppermost, the deepest layer of your mind, comes to the surface. That happens. That's why people sometimes remember and call the name of the dearest or nearest cousin, daughter, son, or whoever may be. When mind is in a totally helpless state, it seeks, it expresses what is uppermost, what you have carried all your life as a dear idea, or person, thing, whatever may be. So, I have heard one devotee recently, I won't mention anybody's name, not long back, even last 2 weeks back, somebody mentioned that his close sister or brother, somebody, was talking about the account book, the stock markets at the time of the last launch. In fact, we're talking to the hospice nurses recently, some time back. That person was a financier, maybe working that line. So, when we identify with any profession or any activity or a person or a spiritual idea, whatever may be, that comes to the surface. All other thoughts are pushed to the background. So, our mind will always have some thought currents. In fact, one definition of mind is an endless thought stream, endless stream consciousness. These are one of the definitions, even in modern times, stream consciousness. So you can't imagine mind without thinking about a constant flow of thought currents. So at the last moment, the uppermost thought current will come to the surface. All secondary thought currents will be pushed to the background. So, but then we will never be able to think of higher spiritual ideal unless we have practiced it, unless we have carried that, even in normal life situations. We can't say the last moment you think of God, it never comes. The story of Ajamila, which I mentioned yesterday,
Yes.
you know, the last moment he called his son's name. Son's name was Narayana, which happened to be a synonym of Lord Vishnu. Now when he called his son to come near him, immediately he remembered that was the very name that he was uttering, he was reciting as a small boy. He was brought up as a God-fearing child. So, its association with his son vanished. Its association with his own spiritual practices during younger days came to the surface. So the angels, Vishnu's lieutenants came. That's the story. That's how it is interpreted. That particular episode. Yesterday we narrated this. So that's why life is an intelligent way to prepare for an intelligent way of leaving this world. That's the idea behind. So yesterday I mentioned the story Ante Narayana Smriti. So in fact the teacher of Bhagavata, this is spiritual classic, he's answered the king who asked him what a dying man should do, who has got only 7 days to live. The answer given was Etavan Sankhya Yogabhyam Sudharma Parinishthaya Janma Nabha Parapupsam Ante Narayana Smriti. Means one should be able to leave this world with God's memory in mind, God's name in mind. And this could be possible. This is possible through the practice of Jnana Yoga. You can think of the absolute reality behind this changing phenomenon world. Or through the practice of unselfish deed, surrendering the results of our actions to God. That also brings in God's idea to the mind. Or by prayer, meditation and so on. Any of these 4 yogas will be helpful. Maybe the easiest in modern times is the practice of a combination of devotion and unselfish action.
Swami, I have one question. On the idea of the Lord being stingy with boon 3, could that come from the reason one is asking, whether it's just for personal escape or if there's really a desire for God? Or
The point is, the highest spiritual truth will be effective only if the spiritual seeker has become totally unselfish. His mind has become completely pure. That's why before we attain absolute purity, the highest spiritual knowledge will not be fully effective. But even if we hear about it, contemplate and still try to attain higher and higher degree of purity, that's fine. So the story, the idea behind is that Yama wanted to test the Nachiketa, this little boy, was absolutely free from any other worldly motive. So long as a trace of worldliness remains within mind, the highest spiritual knowledge or instruction will not be effective. That's a test. So he tempted him. This going through this period of temptation is universal in all theological religious traditions. Sometimes it is interpreted as going through the period of the dark night of the soul, or maybe trials and tribulations, whatever may be. But some kind of trial every spiritual seeker will have to go through. So, in fact, that trial helps us. In fact, and I struggle to go around those temptations, to confront those temptations, helps us to attain a higher and higher level of mental purity. That's it.
Swami, the way you told that, the Katha Upanishad, the story, I've never seen, to me, it's so similar to Jesus' temptation in the wilderness, isn't it? Yeah.
Exactly. Well, Satan tempted him 3 times.
Right.
I often, this question was put to me on a previous occasion, not in San Francisco or outside. Then I tried to answer this again in the light of the famous episode, the fifth section of the Grand Inquisitor in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov.
Yeah.
See, the Grand Inquisitor, the Cardinal, told Jesus, "We are not with you, we are with him," with Satan. He tried to tempt you 3 times. You know, took him to the higher level and asked him to jump and make a miracle. But the one thing that he mentioned is, he tempted you, why don't you turn all these pebbles and stones into loaves of bread? You can give plenty of bread.
Help you. Help you.
Yes.
So the idea is, but Jesus refused. You know why Jesus refused? Dostoevsky himself explains in later occasion. He refused because Jesus didn't want people to follow him blindly. They should choose spiritual freedom of their own and then follow him, not in return for a loaf of bread.
Yes.
That sort of, see, you cannot trade with God. So that's the test. Why don't you distribute plenty of bread among these people and then ask them, come and follow me. That kind of following Jesus will not work in spiritual sense. So you have to leave everything behind you and follow me, that idea behind. So they have to follow him of their own. The free will with the spiritual orientation behind alone can lead you to spiritual fulfillment. That's the idea behind. So, in a way, Yama wanted to see whether this little boy was really fit for the highest spiritual gift. And for that, the first necessity is that he should give up everything else.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
So, some of the time, Bhume Makadayanam Grineshwa. Then in one context, Nachiketa says, Tavaiva Vakas Tava Nritya Gite. This is Nachiketa's reply in one context. Yama told him, I shall give you plenty of dancing damsels, wealth, money. I can make you the emperor of the world. Very much like Satan tempted Jesus, I make you the emperor of the world.
The whole world.
You can use the imperial power to make people follow you.
Yes.
But Jesus didn't do that. So here Nachiketa says, Tavaiva Vahas Tava Nritya Gide. Your all this pleasure, everything, keep it for yourself. I don't want that. The little boy gave a proper retort to Yama's temptations. So as you said, there is a parallelism in this connection. So I think we have...
One quick one. Cody's answer was whether it is a fact or a myth that last thought as the death is true.
Yes, in fact, that's why I discussed this matter with people who faced similar situations, doctors and also some professionals. So they say, in some cases it does work. The 2 examples I gave, there are people who leave God's thoughts in mind, and he don't give anybody's name, but I myself have confronted before coming over in Belur Math, the Swami who taught me the Upanishads. I can give that example. The Swamiji who taught me Upanishads long back, some of the complicated spiritual scriptures, metaphysical works, Shangara's commentaries and super commentaries. He who was suffering from diabetes, and he was almost 85 years old, 86, and then he decided to stop taking medicine. He fell into a coma, and whenever he regained consciousness, he was uttering Upanishad mantras. And again he would go back to coma and passed away. So, unless he must have been uttering these mantras, it's not possible. Look at Gandhi. When Gandhi was shot 3 times, he did not cry and weep.
Yeah.
Come save us. No, he didn't do that. He chanted Rama's name 3 times. Which means he was doing that all his life. And then the financial example, and I need not repeat again, which I got. So there are different examples in many places, in all religious traditions, and all cultural and religious spiritual traditions. You come across such exalted souls. So thank you.
So therefore that leads to that. The last thought
yes.
does lead to that.
Yes, the last thought in a way will have a spiritually elevating effect and continue. We can continue this discussion next time. Tava kathamritam tapta jivanam kavibhirididam kalmashapaham Sravanamangalam Srimata Tadam Bhuvi Kridanti Ye Bhurita Janaha. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Sri Ramakrishna Order.